The distinction between individual groups of peasants, especially between the kulak top of the village and the poor, was too great in land use prior to distribution. Under the pressure of the poor and middle peasants, the kulaks were forced to give up part of their lands, trying to save the best plots and hide the real size of their land with thousands of tricks. During this period, they often succeeded, but the resistance of the kulaks was broken. The poor and middle peasants received over 50 million hectares of kulak land. To master the newly acquired land, we needed working cattle and equipment. Both were very few in the poor, and at the same time they were in abundance among the agricultural bourgeoisie. During the rout of the landed estates before the October Revolution and the spontaneous, unorganized liquidation of the landed estates after the land decree, when the Soviet government was not yet organized locally or consolidated everywhere, the kulaks often seized the best and most of the former landlord means of production. In the best case, with the organized liquidation of estates, the means of production that were in them were sold at auction, who would pay dearer, which fully provided for the interests of the wealthy strata of the village. Archival materials and newspaper reports of this period are filled with numerous complaints of the poor that the kulaks bought horses, productive livestock, dead implements for the pittance, and then they speculated. The Volos councils, into which the kulaks made their way, shied away from pressure on the rural bourgeoisie and sought to impose equally the entire population, regardless of their social status and material condition. According to the questionnaire survey of the People's Commissariat of the RSFSR, in the first half of 1918, 57% of the Volos councils made up their budgets through the imposition of the propertied classes and private commercial and industrial establishments, as well as through acquisitioned estates and the sale of forest materials in the Vladimir province, in Ryazan, 39%, and in the Penza, only 11%. Due to the taxation of the entire rural population, that is, not excluding the poor, in the province of Vladimir it was 16% of its budgets, in Ryazan, 23%, and in the Penza, 46% of the rural municipality councils. The more the area was industrialized, the more naturally the leading role of the working class and its avant-garde the Communist Party was affected, and the more the number of Volos councils sought the income from the taxation of the rural bourgeoisie and through acquisitioned estates. In agrarian backward gubernias, where many left socialist revolutionaries penetrated the Volos councils, the Volos councils sought sources of income through equal taxation of all strata of the population, which, of course, infringed the interests of the poor and middle peasants and benefited the kulaks. There were councils that did not even try to hide their positive attitude towards the agricultural bourgeoisie. So, for example, Milishevsky Volos Council of Spazsky District, Tambov Province on August 1, 1918, i.e., after the decree on the organization of poor committees, during the fierce resistance of the kulaks of the Soviet power, ruled. The rich, the citizens of the militia Volos, any needs not to be taxed. CACC, Fund 393, People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, Inventory 26, D number 237, F43. The class struggle for bread developed with particular acuity. The struggle for bread became the most important part of the struggle for socialism. This struggle was fought by the workers, peasants, the poor and middle peasants, under the leadership of the Bolshevik Party. In the village, committees of the poor were created, which forced kulaks to hand over surplus grain. Even before the decree on the poor's committees, poor organizations were set up on the ground spontaneously, and they put forward their program of struggle against the kulaks. The decree on the committees of the poor issued by the All-Russian Central Executive Committee and the Council of People's Commissars on June 11, 1918, formalized the organization of the rural poor who had come into conflict with the kulaks for taking grain from him, bringing the land to the end, monopoly, for a close alliance with the working class. The decree suggested that all the Soviets immediately begin organizing the comrades. with the invariable participation of the food authorities and under the overall guidance of the People's Commissariat of Food and the All-Russia Central Executive Committee of the Soviets, collected legislation and orders of 1918, number 43, art. 524. The comrades could elect and be elected, all without any restrictions, both local and foreign residents of villages and villages, with the exception of notorious kulaks and rich people, owners who have surplus grain or other food products that have commercial and industrial institutions that use farm labor or wage labor, etc. I bid. In order that there should be no doubt in the localities that only the exploiting kulaks are not allowed to the committees of the poor, and the middle peasants can be elected to the comvides, at the suggestion of Lenin the above paragraph of the decree was accompanied by a note in which it was said that, using wage labor for farming that does not exceed the consumer standard, can elect and be elected to the committees of the rural poor. In August, when the network of committees of the poor began to cover the country, in some places the middle peasants were removed from the participation in the elections of the comrades and opposed the midwives to the comrades. In this connection, on August 17, 1918, the Council of People's Commissars, with the signatures of Lenin and Tsurupa, sent a telegram to all provincial councils and foodstuffs, which sharply emphasized the inadmissibility of opposing the Komlodov to the middle peasants. Lenin stressed that, Soviet power has sought and is striving to meet the needs of the middle stratum of the peasantry, along with the needs of urban workers and the rural poor. Lenin collected Book of X8, p. 143. Decree of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee and the Council of People's Commissars met with warm sympathy from the rural poor. The network of committees of the poor expanded rapidly. In a number of places the Soviets, especially the Volosts, in which the left socialist revolutionaries reigned, resolutely opposed the organization of the poor's committees. Unable to directly reject the organization of the committees, those Volost councils, where the left socialist revolutionaries dominated, hampered the organization of the comrades in every possible way. Sometimes they did not allow the creation of Komlodov, declaring that the functions of the Komlodov would be carried out by the Soviets themselves in order to save money, or because there are no kulaks in the Volost poor committees. Collected Materials, Volume I, Selkizgiz, 1933, p. 91, or referring to the height of the working period in the village IBID, p. 85. A number of district executive committees opposed the organization of the poor's committees, Karachevsky of the Ural province, Karachansky and Lugovsky of the Kursk province, in which the majority belonged to the left seniors. Where the kulaks felt strong for an open struggle against the organization of the poor's committees, it, without concealing it, carried out decrees of the Soviets on the refusal to organize the Komlodov. Thus, for example, the meeting of the Volost Council and village assemblies of all the villages of the Yuryevsky Volost, Myshkinsky district, Yaroslavl province of August 15, 1918, during the discussion of the decree on the convoys, decided not to enforce the decree on the organization of the comrades. CACC, Fund 393, People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, Inventory 26, D 287, Part 2, p. 309. In the Kerensky district of the Penza province, in the village of Rakhmansky at the meeting, the kulaks were not allowed to organize a committee of the rural poor. Then the poor gathered in the field at night and chose a committee of the poor. The newspaper, The Voice of the Labor Peasantry of August 30, 1918. Despite, however, the sabotage shown by a number of Volost and village councils against the organization of the poor committees, despite open kulak uprisings, which led in some places to the destruction of poor committees, to arrests or murders of active workers of the poor, despite the agitation of white guard elements about the imminent overthrow of Soviet power, committees of the rural poor were extremely quickly organized throughout the country. According to far from complete information of the People's Commissar of Foreign Affairs of the RSFSR, by the end of August 31,268 committees of the poor were registered. This information refers to a territory that remained unoccupied by the interventionists. This figure does not include data on the Arkhangelsk, Olonets, Petrograd, Samara, and Simbursk gubernias, for which no information was received. Committee of the RSFSR, a collection of decrees and documents on the committees of the poor, Soviet legislation, 1933, p. 19. The workers' food attachments sent to the village from industrial centers had a great influence on the organization of the comrades, which, according to Lenin, went to the village as conscious preachers of Soviet power. The political commissar, appearing with detachments in the village, says the instruction of the People's Commissariat of Food to the food attachments, collects the gathering of the rural poor, explains to them the essence of the decree on the organization of the poorest sections of the village, the role of village kulaks in the Russian counter-revolution, and invites the poor to elect the committee for collecting grain from the kulaks and for the management of the distribution of grain, agricultural implements and other necessities between the needy. A systematic collection of decrees and orders of the government on Odovolstvenomu case, Book 1I, ed. People's Commissariat of Food, p. 107. The instructions of the People's Commissariat for Food to the food attachments also indicated that the Committee of the Poor, together with the political commissioner of the attachment, ordered the population to surrender weapons, some of which was left to the committee to form a squad, the rest was handed over to the military department. Then the food agents, with the help of attachment and members of the Committee of the Poor, begin to enumerate the stocks of grain of all, not excluding the poor, and to discover all the hidden stocks of grain. From the collected grain, in accordance with the norms, a certain part was deducted for consumer needs, for seeding the fields and for feeding livestock. Of the remaining surpluses, a certain percentage was assigned to the local rural poor, and the rest was exported to the disposal points for the state. Bread, assigned to the local poor, came under the control of the poor man who distributed it among the needy. In a number of cases, the poor committees had to organize special cleaning teams from the local poor. These attachments collectively harvested the bread in former estates or the kulaks, who delayed with cleaning. With bread came in accordance with the decree. Straw was distributed among the needy for a small fee or free of charge, depending on the property position. To speed up this harvesting and to help the local poor from the provincial town, special workers' attachments were often sent. For example, from Moscow to Oral Province alone in September 1918, 15 such attachments were dispatched. The Committee of the Voronezh and Kursk regions. Materials on the history of the Komvadov, Voronezh Regional Book Publishing, 1935, p. 111. To make an accurate account of bread and prevent its diversion, the poor committees had to establish control over the work of village mills. But many mills belonged to kulaks who shied away from control and generally sabotaged the decisions of the comrades. Therefore, the confrades confiscated the mills. So the logic of the class struggle for bread led to the fact that the comrades greatly expanded the functions of their activities. The committees of the poor engaged themselves not only in seizing grain surpluses and in supplying the poor with grain, but should in any measure provide the rural poor with the means of production so that they could master the land provided to it by the proletarian revolution. The rural poor demanded a new distribution of living and dead implements of the former landed estates and surplus funds of production of kulak farming. The Committee took the removal of surplus stock and livestock from the kulaks and its distribution among the poor. The resistance of the kulaks often turned into an open armed uprising against Soviet power, which compelled the latter to use military measures to suppress the armed resistance of the kulaks. Comdem had to deal with other issues, including the supply of firewood to cities, railways, factories. In forest areas there was a predatory felling of forests. The kulaks were speculating with firewood, At the request of the land departments, the Guards took over the protection of the forest. They were also entrusted with the woodworking, which the comrades used to compel the rural bourgeoisie forcibly. For example, one of the numerous documents that vividly depicts the vigorous and classless intransigent style of work of the kombodov in this sector of the national economy. The loading and preparation of firewood must be carried out by all the society, attracting kulaks, priests, merchants, speculators and other bourgeois elements to such. Firewood should be distributed at the discretion of the convoys, and also the transportation of firewood must be made by society, that is, all free horses are driven out and brought to the village, where the commodities are distributed at their discretion. Persons who do not come for the preparation of firewood are subject to a fine at the discretion of the local comrades. From the Protocol No. 3 of the Congress of Chairmen, Comrades of Chairmen and Secretaries of Village Committees of the Rural Poor in the Kzy Novolost of Starouskolsky Uyezd, Kursk Province of December 7, 1918. See the collection, The Comedy of the Vernage and Kursk Regions, p. 282. The Comrades, however, enforced the collection of an extraordinary revolutionary tax imposed on the rural bourgeoisie by the Council of People's Commissars. The committees of the rural poor organized the sending of detachments to the front, to the Red Army from the peasant population, to fight the interventionists and to help the troops that were liquidating the anti-Soviet counter-revolutionary uprising. Many committees of the poor organized special regiments of the poor, who were advanced units in the Red Army. Volos committees of the poor in accordance with the decree exchanged part of the surplus of non-standardized products they collected for industrial products. The distribution between the population of industrial goods the committees of the poor commissioned to produce cooperations. Thanks to this, the Guards directly encountered the activities of the cooperatives and established control over it. Thus, in fact, there was virtually no side of the economic and political life of the village, which would not be run by the poor's committees. During this decisive battle between the poor peasants and the agricultural bourgeoisie, the party pursued a policy of neutralization in relation to the middle peasants. The middle peasant whimpered and hesitated between the revolution and the counter-revolution, while they overthrew the bourgeoisie, while the power of the Soviets was not yet consolidated, and therefore it was necessary to neutralize it. The middle peasant began to turn to us when he began to see that the bourgeoisie was overthrown in earnest, that the power of the Soviets was becoming stronger, the kulaks were overcoming, the Red Army was beginning to win on the civil fronts. Stalin, Questions of Leninism, ed. 11th, p. 165. The march of the proletarians to the countryside and the organization of the poor committees strengthened the Soviet power in the countryside and had enormous political significance for the conquest of the middle peasant to the side of Soviet power. History of the CPSU, B. Short Course, p. 212. The characterization of the activity of the Kombodov will be incomplete if we ignore their work on organizing collective farms. A large number of poor people, having returned from the front, could not master the land received because of the complete lack of equipment. A considerable number of workers from factories came to the village. These proletarian and semi-proletarian elements were often organized in agricultural communes, settled in abandoned and dilapidated landed estates, where they again started farming, or organized in artels or partnerships for the public cultivation of land directly in the villages. The workers and employees who came to the village in connection with the suspension of work in a number of factories had enormous influence in the workmen's guards. Among the chairmen of Volos Comrades of the Tambov gubernia, 22.4% were workers who worked in factories and plants before the war, and only 55.3% were employed before the war by agriculture. Of these, 42.7% were engaged in agriculture during the war, that is, most of the chairmen of the committees were separated from agriculture during the war. Thus, A rather large core in the committees of the poor was made up of workers and soldiers, i.e., the most revolutionary element, who had passed through the school of political struggle in factories or at the front. Even more revealing is the fact that there is a fairly large stratum of communists in the KGB. According to the Tambov province, 46.8% of communists and 34.6% of sympathizers were among the chairmen of Volos committees of the poor. Only 18.6% indicated in their questionnaires that they were non-party. Even if we take the whole composition of the workers of the poor committees, including members of the comrades, treasurers, secretaries, department heads and technical workers, the number of members of the Communist Party was 33%, sympathizers 48%, and non-partisans only 19%. Committees of the Poor, Collection of Materials, Volume I, p. 182, 183. Other figures testify to the influence of communists in the committees of the poor. For example, at the Congress of the Kombedovs of the Ural Province, held on October 1, 1918, out of 261 delegates there were 113 communists and 146 sympathizers, and only 2 delegates were left socialist revolutionaries. Journal, The Soviet State, No. 4, for 1933, p. 118. At the Dmitrievsky IE's Congress of the Commune, Kursk Province on September 15, 1918, out of 247 delegates of the communists and sympathizers there were 233, the left socialist revolutionaries 1 and 1 maximalists, in the same place. At the first Shuyaized Congress of the Commune of the Vladimir Province 63.6% were communists and sympathizers and 31.2% non-party people. There are a lot of such examples. Committees of the poor were created at a time when the Soviets in the village were heavily clogged by kulak and socialist revolutionary elements. The influence of the kulak socialist revolutionary elements was explained by the fact that in some places the old Zemstvo organizations were renamed the Soviets. In other places, elections to the first Soviets took place before the sharp class split in the village, and the kulaks managed to take them into their own hands. These Soviets could exist only in conditions of insufficiently developed class struggle in the countryside. By the end of 1918, when the class struggle in the village unfolded with exceptional depth and severity, such Soviets could no longer exist as an authoritative body. They did not express the true interests of the broad masses of working people. The poor's committees expressed the interests of the broad masses of labor more than the village councils. This meant that the Soviets had to be re-elected. The revolutionary elements of the village, the workers of the comrades, were to enter them. This was formulated by Lenin in a speech to the delegates of the poor's committees in the Moscow region. The comrades and councils in the villages should not exist separately. Otherwise, squabble and unnecessary word-making will turn out. We will merge the committees with Soviets. We will make the committees become Soviets. Lenin, Works, Volume XXIII, p. 283. By this statement, Lenin sharply raised the question of the need to end the friction that arose in a number of places between the Soviets and the committees, by eliminating one of the 2 parallel organizations. These frictions first arose between the food departments of the Volos councils and the Komdumi, where the poor committees did not expand their activities widely and did not fully cover all aspects of the economic and political life of the village. The county councils often turned the committees into an appendage to the food authorities. For example, Gorochansky, Kursk Gubernia, the District Executive Committee on October 25, 1918, ruled, all Volos committees of the rural poor should be added to the rural food committees for their joint work, and the county committee of the rural poor must enter the county food committee as instructors. The Committee of the Vernage and Kursk regions, p. 127. In the Kursk district of the same province, the County Bureau of the Merchants in their appeal to all organizations complain about the difficult situation of the Kombedov, with whom local councils are not considered. On the contrary, In the Ural province, where there was a dense network of comrades, on September 16, 1918, at a joint meeting of the Ural Provincial and City Committees of the RCP-B, the Provincial Executive Committee and the Provincial Food Commission, a decision was made that all Volost food committees are subordinate to committees POR. On the ground, they went even further. In the Bolokov and Yelets districts of the Ural province, the food departments of the Volost councils were liquidated and their functions were transferred to the comrades. In a number of districts, district committees of the POR were established, not provided for by the decree, and in the Ural, Saratov and Moscow provinces even the provincial committees of the POR. The county and provincial committees of the POR themselves wanted to lead the activities of Volost and rural Kombinov, which was the law and the duty of the Soviets alone. From each of the parties seized from the kulaks of bread, the comrades received a certain share, which they distributed among the needy, which created them great authority in the eyes of the rural population in comparison with the Volkov councils, who did not have any food reserves at their disposal. At the disposal of the POR's committees were large financial resources formed from fines imposed on the bourgeoisie and speculators, whereas the rural municipality councils often ran amok without money and delayed the payment of salaries to their employees, teachers and hospital personnel. This situation led to the fact that in a number of places the county councils passed resolutions on the liquidation of Volost and rural councils and the transfer of all power to the committees of the POR. The Volost councils were liquidated in the Petrovsky district of the Saratov province. The commies of the RSFSR, P120, Alexandrovsky Uyezd of the Vladimir province, c. POR from November 14, 1918, Morshansk district of the Tambov province, c. Kombity of the RSFSR, P24, Buysk and Miraksky districts of Kostroma province, in 6 Volos of Yelets district of Ural province, Lepel district of Vitebsk province. Kursk POR from December 9, 1918. The Kaluga-Sponge and Vishny-Volotsky Congress of the Village POR spoke for transferring all power to the Kombitov, the voice of the working peasantry of October 2, 1918. All these actions were erroneous and harmful, since they were based on mistrust of the middle peasants and lack of understanding of the transient role of the POR committees. The committees of the rural POR, having fulfilled the tasks assigned to them, have outlived themselves, so Lenin raised the question of their liquidation. Steady revolutionary elements, grouped around the Kombitov, were to enter the councils. In December 1918, January 1919 throughout the country were re-elections of councils, and what was predicted by Lenin. The councils included the best elements of the village. The committees of the POR were unnecessary. They fulfilled their historical role. The committees of the POR were so established that we found it possible to replace them with properly chosen Soviets, that is, to reorganize the rural Soviets so that they become organs of class domination, organs of proletarian power in the village. Lenin, Soch. XXIV, p. 162. Thus, the committees of the rural POR, despite their short, 6-month existence, from June to December 1918, rendered a great help to the working class in mobilizing the revolutionary forces of the village. In his speech of January 17, 1919, Lenin said that, "The resolution on the formation of POR committees is a step that represents the whole basis of our food policy and at the same time is of tremendous importance, a turning point in the entire course of development and structure of our revolution. By this step we have crossed the line between the bourgeois revolution and the socialist revolution, for one victory of the working class in the cities and one transition of all factories to the hands of the proletarian state. All this would not be able to consolidate and create the foundations of the socialist order, if in the village they also did not create for themselves a proletarian support, not of the general peasant, but of a really proletarian." Lenin, SOCH, Volume XXIII, p. 460. Anyone who has observed rural life, who has come into contact with the peasant masses in the countryside, says, the October Revolution of towns for the village became a real October Revolution only in the summer and autumn of 1918 IBID, p. 252. Under the direct leadership of the Bolshevik Party, the poor committees trained the cadres of the main workers in the Soviets in the village, created and united around them wide circles of the poor, politically organized and educated them. The committee seized from the rural bourgeoisie grain, which the proletariat needed so much, the Red Army defending the revolution, and the rural poor. The seizure of surplus grain, dead implements and livestock from the rural bourgeoisie, what was then usually called dekulakization, did not eliminate the roots of capitalism in the countryside. While there was an individual peasantry, there remained that social ground on which capitalist relations grew. But the seizure of surplus grain and implements greatly weakened the resistance of the rural bourgeoisie to the victorious course of the socialist revolution. The committees of the poor have completed their distribution of land to the end. They have not allowed the kulaks to use the nationalization of the land in their own interests. The union of the toiling masses of the proletariat of the city and the rural poor, which found its organizational expression in the form of committees of the poor, dealt a crushing blow to the kulaks and thereby helped to isolate it, liberate the middle peasant from under kulak influence, and turn the middle peasants towards Soviet power. All this, together with the general consolidation of the Soviets and the first victories on the fronts of the civil war that has begun, created the conditions for a transition from a policy of neutralizing the middle peasants to a policy of a firm alliance of the working class with the middle peasant, supported by the poor.